watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture.
Well, we are in New York and near the United Nations, and so it's my pleasure to invite one of Israel's most eloquent spokesmen, Israel's ambassador to the UN, Ron Prosor.
Hi. First of all, it's really an honor to be part of this conference and this very distinguished lineup. I have to say this is the first time, I think, in the history of the Times Square Marriott that there are more stars here in this lobby, in this hotel, than in Broadway billboards outside of this street. Look, as you know, there was a vacancy here at the UN for quite a while. I was Israel's ambassador to the Court of St. James, and I couldn't come earlier because there were two policy events there that I was preoccupied with. The first very important policy event was the royal wedding between Kate and William. You know, someone had to represent you, and I did that, took that responsibility. And the second policy event was Manchester United against Barcelona. Only then could I come here to New York and meet for the first time the Council on Human Rights. The Council on Human Rights, it's like, you know, the feeling that you had the inmates taking over the asylum. We had a situation which is really important for you to notice. This is a situation where in the human rights we have an Article 4 that talks about human rights violations all over the world. And there's an Article 7 that talks about human rights violations only for Israel. I'll repeat that again. Article 4, human rights violations all over the world, from Sudan, Syria, Egypt, Bahrain, you name it. And an Article 4 that singles out Israel. And this is something that you probably would say, okay, people would be shocked. Surprisingly enough, when the vote goes on, who votes against this resolution? Only 4 countries. The United States of America, Israel, Canada, and the great empire of Palau. I have to admit that the first thing that I did was go over and look for the ambassador of Palau. I found him in a building in New York on the 15th floor, knocked on his door and said, "Ambassador, I came to say thank you." He looked at me, he's Palau's ambassador for the last 15 years, and said, "No one has ever come to say thank you." Since then, in every reception, I hear about Palau. But the point that I want to make is that great nations in Europe, like the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and you name it, always abstain on resolutions like that and basically create a situation where Israel, on that level, in resolutions that are horrific resolutions, is left behind with countries that I mentioned only supporting it. The Human Rights Council, in that sense, I think it's like having Charles Manson run the crime investigation squad of the NYPD. But the point that I want to make is that we have here not double standards that people are talking about. We have triple standards. One standard for democracies, one standard for dictatorships, and a special standard for Israel. That basically Israel or any other country or any human being cannot really reach or attain. And Deputy Foreign Minister Daniel Alon, my friend and colleague, alluded to that we, ladies and gentlemen, you have to be very clear on this. We are on a battlefield fighting a completely different war than we have fought in the past. Here in this distinguished audience are people who fought to really protect the state of Israel on the military side. They tried to get us in economic with the Arab boycott. And today, they're going for what I would call the soft spot of going to demonize and delegitimize Israel and basically creating a situation where we divide ourselves inside Israel and between Israel and the Jewish diaspora outside of Israel, because it goes against everything that we all cherish and believe in. Hence, our common values, things that we are proud of, things that we feel we can teach the world. And that is why it's so dangerous, and that is why the people who are standing on the front line here at the United Nations or in Israel's embassies abroad are on the trenches. And we need your support, because this goes to, like I said, the soft belly. And what is demonizing and what is delegitimizing? It's very, very hard to call. It's very sophisticated. It's like Chinese torture. Drop, 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 and you have to call it. And when I say you have to call it, you have to stand up and say, just a second. There are myths, there are facts, there are lies, there are half-lies, and you have to stand up and say, hey, that's a lie, that's wrong. And last week, I stood up at the Security Council and said, look at the repetition. By repeating things again and again and again, it doesn't mean those things are correct. How many times have you all heard the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a major conflict in the Middle East? You solve that, you solve all the other conflicts in the Middle East. Really? Really? Bahrain, Tunisia, Syria have absolutely any one centrifuge in Iran stopped spinning because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So that repetition doesn't make it true, and today it's ridiculed. Last week, Security Council resolution, by the way, every month, the situation in the Middle East, 95%, if not more, deals with every balcony at every settlement. Syria, Bashar butchers his own people left and right. Approximately 5% is being dealt on the world stage. And it's important to go back and say, and it doesn't make a difference where you stand politically, by the way. The repetition of settlements are the major hurdle to peace? No, that's not true. You can define it. It doesn't make a difference where you stand politically. It might be a thorn in the eye. It might be not. It doesn't make a difference. A major hurdle to peace? No. The major hurdle to peace is the major hurdle to peace is the Palestinians' quest for the so-called right of return. That's a major hurdle to peace. And why is it the major hurdle to peace? Because you don't hear the Palestinian leadership saying anything about that. You don't hear the international community saying anything about that. And even in Israel, although we are probably going into an election year, even the left side of the left part of the Israeli political spectrum, hence those who are holding on the left side of the Rock of Gibraltar, not falling from the fingertips of the left, wouldn't sign any peace agreement with a right of return being part of it, because it means the destruction of the state of Israel. The right of return is the only equation in political science which is a mathematical equation. Right of return equals the destruction of the state of Israel. That is why it is of paramount importance, in my mind, to really again and again talk about Israel as the nation, as the homeland, and the nation state of the Jewish people. And the recognition of that is really directly talking about the forfeiting of the right of return, and that's why it's important, and we need that because that is what will allow comprehensive peace in the region. The things that I want to add are Israel beyond the conflict. And this is also important because I want to tell you that I walk those corridors of the United Nations tall and proud. I walk them tall and proud because I know who I represent, what I represent, and it's amazing under the radar screen to see the respect that the State of Israel and the Jewish people receive. And we just had Yom HaAtzmaut and the celebration of Yom HaAtzmaut, and I can tell you that the amount of people that came from different countries around the world, who sometimes above the radar screen stand up and say things that I need earplugs about the State of Israel, the respect of what Israel does, not just in drip irrigation, with doctors going all around the world, and what Israel really stands for is something that should make all of you very, very proud. And we should continue doing that. Now, this is not just words. When we introduce a resolution on agricultural technologies, and we work, hence we go out there with a full court press, surprise, surprise, 102 countries co-sponsor the resolution, and 130 countries support it. And this shows that beyond and under the radar screen, that support is there, and we should try and push that very, very strong, because in many countries, small allocation of resources can make a huge difference on the way Israel is perceived in the world arena. And there's to my mind, an additional point which I can see taking place in the United Nations that you should be aware of. For the first time, you see a change in the way the Arab world acts. And for me, to be Israel's ambassador to the United Nations and see the Saudi ambassador literally shaking in the General Assembly and pointing fingers at the Iranian ambassador because of what they tried to do in taking out the Saudi ambassador Abdul Jubair in the Washington Beltway is new. It's a new phenomenon. And when you see the Saudis and the Gulfis and others go out against the Syrians in the General Assembly, in the Security Council, this is something which is completely new. And when you see the Kuwaiti ambassador, after the Syrian ambassador loses his posture, raises his name tag, Kuwait, usually he doesn't say a word, and says, after I heard the Syrian ambassador, I want to tell you that not only do I vote against him, but I co-sponsor the resolution against him. This is a new world. And I'm talking about that because it allows us to do what we have to do, hence use the opportunities that have aroused in the Arab world because they feel that the rope is tightening around their necks on certain issues to find common ground from a common enemy like Iran. And there are huge risks taking place in the region, but also they open up opportunities. And it's our responsibility to navigate between the risks and the opportunities in a completely changing environment that takes place before us. And maybe the last thing that I want to say is that, look, after saying everything that I said today, it's important for you to understand, and I know that you do, that if we have one friend who stands up with us every day, that is the United States of America and the American people. And not only my 4 years in Washington, D.C., but every day, the United Nations, I see the United States of America with everything that goes on, basically on the front line with Israel. And this is something that I want to thank you because each and every one of you helps and supports that great, great relationship between the American people and the Jewish people in the State of Israel. And you know, as I know, that the State of Israel will reach out to achieve peace with our neighbors. But we have to do that with the shield of David very, very close to our chest, because only a strong Israel and a very united Israel can really achieve comprehensive peace in that region. And I know, Steve, last but not least, if the President of the State of Israel would be here, we would probably conclude that, Shimon Peres, by saying, ladies and gentlemen, we need more solutions than resolutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Prosor. I'd now like to call upon Israel's most articulate advocate in the United States and perhaps the entire world, man who needs no introduction, Professor Alan Dershowitz.
Thank you so much. First of all, I am so thrilled that Ambassador Ron Prosor is Israel's ambassador to the United Nations. He makes precisely the kind of defense at the United Nations and around the world that is needed. So please, you really deserve our tremendous appreciation. We all hope this is the first of many conferences, and therefore I want to have a little chutzpah and suggest a few rules for how these conferences should proceed in the future. The first rule, please, is do not ever boo a president of the United States, no matter who that president is, no matter whether you agree with the president or disagree with the president. Do not ever boo a president of the United States. Nobody speaking on behalf of Israel or who is perceived as speaking on behalf of Israel should ever, ever engage in that kind of conduct. Number two, please, Israelis, do not bring your political domestic battles to the international forum. Do not play them out here in front of the world. You are the most articulate and feisty group of people in any democracy in the world. There is plenty of opportunity, plenty of occasion to play these out in the Knesset, on television in Israel. But when you come to international forums, please speak in a united fashion. Present Israel's case. Present what I call the 80% case, the consensus case, the case that we all agree on, the case that doesn't divide us, the case that unites us. And finally, recognize, as the former Prime Minister and others have said, that when it comes to existential decisions that must be made about Israel's security, only the people of Israel and their elected officials can make those decisions. They cannot be made by Americans sitting in Times Square or in Brooklyn or in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or in the Oval Office. They must be made by the people of Israel. The people of Israel can assess the risks, and that's what it means to be a democracy. And so I want to spend my few minutes talking about what the appropriate role of the diaspora is in addressing the most serious existential problem Israel has ever faced, namely a nuclear Iran. This is a new problem for the diaspora community. We have never before been in a position to really take decisions or help make decisions or take positions on decisions that involve Israel's existential survival. There was no opportunity in 1948 for there to be input. It was a war of ein b'reira. There was no choice. In 1967, there was a surprise attack planned. In 1973, again, on Yom Kippur, a surprise attack. The Osiris reactor in 1981, we had no input. Nobody knew that was going to happen. Whatever happened in Syria, the same thing was true with a nuclear reactor. Others, there has been an opportunity for input, but they were not existential decisions. 1956, the Lebanon wars, cast lead. So this is a very unusual situation in which the Jewish community, the pro-Israel community, is speaking out, and in a very divisive way as well, about what Israel should do in relation to Iran. And I want to urge some diffidence and some caution and some modesty when it comes to participating in that debate. The issue is, I needn't tell you, extraordinarily complex. It is extraordinarily multifaceted. It is ever-changing. It is a problem, and I can tell you this having spoken to leaders both in this country and in Israel and intelligence people in both countries, there is no certainty involved. We are dealing with probabilities. This is a problem of Bayesian analysis with ever-shifting factors. This is not something you can simply express a clear, permanent, unalterable position on. It is the most difficult decision Israel has probably ever had to make. And whether you consider the Iranians rational or not rational, I can tell you one thing about the current leadership. They are clever and strategic. They understand precisely how to exploit differences between the United States and Israel over timing, over red lines. Don't ever underestimate the cleverness of the Iranians. They are perhaps the cleverest enemy that Israel and the United States has ever faced. Many of you know the work of people like Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize, and Tversky, who tragically died before he could have won the Nobel Prize, about how difficult it is for human beings to make decisions based on shifting probabilities. We're just not very good at it. Neither are intelligence agencies all that good at it. We have seen instance after instance where intelligence agencies have made mistakes when it comes to decisions of this kind. Particularly in this case, the considerations point in multiple directions. Obviously, everybody in this room agrees, and I know the President of the United States agrees because I've spoken to him about this issue. Everybody agrees that no country, least of all a country comprised of people who suffered near extinction 70 years ago, no country can ever leave its destiny in the hands of another nation. No matter how much one trusts the United States or any particular president of the United States, the decision about what Israel must do must be made by Israel. By the way, this would be the same no matter who the Prime Minister of Israel was. It would be the same no matter who the President of the United States was. This is not a question of personalities. This is not a question of parties. This is not a question of bipartisanship. This is a question of the reality. Israel must make that decision. But it's also true that Israel's long-term survivability, regardless of the great steps forward that it's taken to protect itself and create independence militarily, Israel, however, does need the support of the United States. And there's no question, therefore, that although Israel must make its own decision, it must consider what the implications will be for the alliance with the United States. So even that factor pushes in different directions. A surgical strike may very well weaken the mullahs, but it may very well strengthen them. We just don't know. We talked about the unpredictability of the Arab Spring, the unpredictability of what an Israeli strike would be, assuming it would be successful, on the Iranians' ability to garner support among other Muslim and Arab nations and in the international community, and indeed among its own people, is less than certain. It is also clear that Israel would be credited by some, blamed by others, credited by some publicly, credited by others privately. The mix of what the reaction would be is utterly unpredictable. The one thing I think that's very clear is that Israel would have the legal and moral right to take unilateral action if it felt it was necessary to its own survival. The case for Israel's right to do it is extremely compelling. Number one, Iran is already in a state of war with Israel. Iran has attacked Israeli territory both directly, obviously in Argentina years ago, and indirectly through providing weapons that are being used directly against Israeli citizens through Hezbollah and Hamas. So Iran is in a state of war with Israel. An attack by Israel on Iran's nuclear reactors, were it to come, would not be a preventive or a preemptive attack. It would, under law, be a reactive attack, and a perfectly lawful reactive attack. Having said that, I don't think that Ambassador Prosor would disagree with me when I say that the international community might take a somewhat different view of this matter. So in every instance, we are seeing issues that push in multiple directions. So I really do believe that a little deference and a little humility in the face of these uncertainties is required. I think that we who love Israel, who care for Israel, who have ideas that we think might be interesting or useful, we should never, ever hesitate to advise Israel, but do not dictate to Israel. Israel must make its own decision. That's what it means to be a democracy. The essence of a democracy is the right and the power to assess the risks and to decide on the destiny of your people and to bear the consequences of an erroneous decision. Put another way, the right of a democracy is not only the right to be right, but the right to be wrong. The right to make decisions and bear the consequences, because it will be the Israeli people who will bear any consequences. It will be the Israeli people who will reap the benefits if there are to be benefits. I'm asked all the time, do I think that Israel should unilaterally attack Iran if the United States does not do so? I refuse to answer that question. I do not know enough to answer that question. I know enough to say it would be legal. I know enough to say it would be moral. I know enough to say that if Israel were forced to do it, whether I agreed or disagreed with the decision, I would support it and defend it. I'm not sure the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, is aware that I was not completely supportive in every instance of every aspect of Operation Cast Lead, but I felt that Israel had the right to make that decision. And not, as a non-Israeli, I felt very comfortable defending Israel's right to make that decision and defending its actions and defending it against improper charges in the Goldstone report. And I think that that essentially is the role that Americans and others who support Israel but don't get a vote, don't get to vote. We could get a vote if we wanted to. We could vote with our feet. Everybody in this room has the right to make aliyah and move to Israel and make decisions for Israel. But as long as we remain in the comfort of Cambridge and Times Square and in the United States, our role must be limited. Our role is to advise, our role is to support, our role is to counsel, our role, for those of you who believe in that, is to pray for. Every Shabbat we pray for the people of Israel and the state of Israel. But in the end, our role is to recognize who must make that decision. And so my promise to the Israeli government is this: whatever decision you make, and please let it be a wise one and a careful one, and one that considers all the implications, positive and negative, and I don't have to say this, a decision that is not based on domestic political considerations, either for Israel or for the United States, a decision that is wise and thoughtful. Whatever decision Israel makes, I will support it. I will defend it. I will advocate it. And I hope all of you will do the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dershowitz, for your wise counsel. I have just received an email from our news editor in Jerusalem where it's after 7 p.m. in the evening to say that this conference is the top of all news bulletins and websites in Israel. And we've only just begun. It's now my pleasure to invite the former commander of the Israel Air Force and the current CEO of El Al, Eliezer Shkedy.
Shalom to all of you. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here with you and to speak in front of such a distinguished audience. I intend to talk about three things: proportion, optimism, and inventing Israel. I'm sure that each and every one of you has a unique family with an amazing story. And I would like to tell you two stories through my family. I'm a son of a sole survivor from an entire family. My father, Moshe Shkedy, jumped from a train in 1944, and he is a sole survivor from all his family in Hungary, Budapest. The story is like this. When I was the Air Force commander, I got a lot of invitations to each and every event in Israel. Honestly, I do not like events. So usually, I had an excuse, I have to work, and please say thank you, and I will not come. Anyhow, one day, my secretary, Avital, came to my office and they told me, you know, you have an invitation from President Peres. He would like to invite you to eat dinner with him and with the president of Hungary. I told her the regular way, please thank him and say that I will not come. Okay. Couple of weeks after a couple of weeks, I used to look at the next week. She came to me and she said, you know, next week you have a dinner with President Peres and the president of Hungary. I told her, how come? I told you to cancel it. She said, I think that you make a mistake, so I didn't do it. Just imagine such a situation to me. So I had two alternatives. The first one, to kill her. The second one, since I really loved her, I knew that she really cared about it, to think that she is right. So I told her, you know, call the president's office and tell them that I would like to come, but I would like to bring my father with me. She called and she said, yes, they called and the president would like to invite your father as well. I called to my father. I told him, you know, father, President Peres inviting you to the dinner with the president of Hungary. There was a silence on the other side, and he told me, I will come. The day arrived. I drove to Kfar Saba to take him from Kfar Saba to, Kfar Saba is near Tel Aviv, to take him from Kfar Saba to Jerusalem. He is from Hungary, and you know Hungarians, they are talking a lot. Anyhow, since the time he entered to the car, until we always reach Jerusalem, not a word. Before entering Jerusalem, he looked at me and he said, do you understand what's going on? I told him, of course, we are going to eat with President Peres and the president of Hungary, and later on I'll take you back. He looked at me and he said, you understand nothing. Most of the people in this hall understand what I mean. Like the Agadah of Pesach and the Chad Gadya, it was like this. And he said, I, Moshe Shkedy, is going to meet the president of the state of Israel, my country. Again, I, Moshe Shkedy, and I am going to meet the president of the state of Israel, my country, with my son, who is the commander of the Israeli Air Force, and he used to say, and the commander of the Air Force of the Jewish nation. Another step. I am going to meet the president of Hungary, that in those days in Budapest, the value of my life in those days was less than the value of a dead dog. And I am going to meet the president of Hungary that does not know yet that he is going to apologize. You don't know my father, this is the words. And then he continued. And he said, you know, if someone would have asked me 65 years ago to dream the most amazing, unbelievable dream about what will be 65 years later, no way that I would have been even close to this situation. So, about the proportions, these are the proportions. The second thing about is the optimism. I am really optimistic about the future of the Jewish nation and the state of Israel. And if you would like to know, the president of Hungary apologized. The second thing, nowadays, there is a big debate in Israel. I think that most of you knows a little bit about it. And this is about the concept, is all the citizens of Israel should take part in the service in Israel, either in the military way or in a civilian way. Personally, I believe that each and every one in Israel should take part, and we should do it, and we will do it through the democratic way. We are on the way. I would like to tell you the second story about something that is related to the ultra-Orthodox and the Air Force. Do you know that the ultra-Orthodox in Israel do not serve? Mainly, most of them. There are two thoughts about the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. First one, they don't want to work. They are not working. Second thing, that they do not want the existence of the state of Israel. I totally disagree. First of all, I don't know a man that don't want to bring food to his wife and to his children. The second thing, in 4 eyes talking with ultra-Orthodox, I can tell you honestly, they want the existence of the state of Israel like me. And the third thing, who are these ultra-Orthodox? My grandfather, probably your grandfather. They are not coming from the moon. They are like us. We have to find a way to be with them, to let them be with us. It will take me 3 minutes. So, when I called the rabbi of the Air Force and I told him, tell me, Rabbi, what are you in charge of? He told me, I am in charge of kosher and Shabbat. I told him, I don't need you. I will be in charge of kosher and Shabbat. We are in the state of Israel. We are going to eat kosher, and Shabbat we will work and do whatever is needed in Shabbat. So he told me, what do you want from me? I want from you to bring ultra-Orthodox to the Air Force. He told me, I cannot do it. I told him, you can, bring. Anyhow, a couple of weeks later, he told me, I found 50. What will you do with them? I told him we are going to send them to be technicians, to teach them and to send them to the air bases. Okay. I took myself, I met them at the first day that they arrived to the Air Force, and I told them this thing. I came especially to tell you that I really want you. The kosher issues is not an issue at all. If you are going to, the teacher will be a man or a woman, we are going to solve it. Not a problem. Anyhow, they came to the bases, and after a couple of weeks, the base commander called me and told me, please send me only ultra-Orthodox. They were great. Anyhow, a lot of ultra-Orthodox joined the Air Force, later on to the Navy and to the intelligence and other branches of the IDF. Then I called to the rabbi and told him, Rabbi, now I would like you to bring the best of the best from Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. He told me, what do you mean? I want you to bring ultra-Orthodox from the best yeshivas in Israel. I don't know the names. Hebron Yeshiva, Jerusalem Yeshiva, I don't know. He told me something like this I really cannot do. And a lot of people in the IDF told me, no way, you won't succeed. We won't let you to succeed over our dead body. And when I was the Air Force commander, I had only one commander, the commander of the IDF. He's sitting here, Gabi Ashkenazi. I knew that Gabi will not say no to this idea, so I continued. Anyhow, after a couple of weeks, he found 50 students from yeshivas. They didn't know English, and they didn't know mathematics. We decided to take them to the most complicated place, to computer concept. People told me, no way, they will not succeed. All of them succeed. Most of them was graduated from the course with distinction. They knew how to study 16 hours per day, even though they didn't know English and mathematics, and now they are working with the best of the best in the best unit in Israel. It's good for them, it's good for Israel, it's very good for the Jewish nation. And from my perspective, 65 or 70 years ago, the Nazis explained us on the queue to the chambers that we are one nation. It doesn't matter what is the size of the kippah, black kippah, small kippah, half kippah, half Jew, quarter Jew. We should understand it by ourselves. And what we are doing now in Israel, that we are really inventing Israel almost every day. It's an ongoing process. So I'm optimistic. I think that the proportion of where we are now, according to where we were 70 years ago, is amazing. And the ongoing inventing Israel is a process. I would like to wish all of us to continue on the same direction, with the same spirit. And the sky is the limit. All the best.
The sky's the limit. Thank you very much, Eliezer Shkedy, for providing us also with some light relief and some humor. Before we break for lunch, I'd like to introduce one of Israel's top newsmakers, the former director of the Mossad, Meir Dagan.
Shalom Uvracha. I don't have the capability of Shkedy to tell you stories in the air. He is the Air Force, I'm from the ground forces. But I have to admit that everything that he said is really something that he's speaking from his heart, and I can't really affiliate myself with what he's describing, because also I'm unfortunately coming from a family that survived the Holocaust, and I know exactly what his father felt, and each family in the Jewish nation have a different story and a very unique one. If you are comparing the problems that Israel is facing and the challenges, then we are the largest and the biggest superpower in the world. We have the quantity of problems and tourists like no country in the world, even though we are a small country of a few million people. But the problems that we are and the challenges that we are facing are enormous. I try in a short period of time to discuss a little bit some of those challenges that Israel is facing. I will start with the first one, the Palestinian challenge. We are already engaged almost 20 years with a dialogue with the Palestinians. And unfortunately, we failed. I don't think that we draw the right lessons from our failures. And it's a necessity to find a way and to find a solution for the Palestinian problem. I think we have to pay attention to the process that is shaping up in the Palestinian community, especially in the dialogue and the conflicts between the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas, and the consequences of what is by mistake known as the Arab Spring. Another issue that we have to take in consideration, how the Palestinian Authority will be seen after the days of Abu Mazen. It's a very serious problem, and any solution that we'll deal and find on this very challenging problems will have to take in consideration all the facts that I mentioned before. The Iranian challenge is a very serious one. It is the most challenging military and political problem that Israel is facing. It's very much related to the goals of the Iranian Revolution, and especially about the impact that the Iranian regime wants to become the leading of the Muslim world. We have to take in consideration the impact of the long war between Iraq and Iran that was taking for 8 long years, and the Iranian paid hundreds of thousands of casualties. The Iranians now are involved internally in a conflict inside the Muslim world, and they're trying to acquire a military nuclear capability that is threatening the stability of the region, and probably will engage an arms race, not only in the Middle East, but in the region at all, and probably in the world. Iran is playing a role of destabilizing, a negative role of destabilizing the region and trying to present itself as a superpower in the region. And they would like to become a focal point in having an impact on the region, on economy, and especially of leading the Muslim world. Let's not forget that Iran is sitting in the center where 65% of the oil reserves, oil of the world are located. And any impact the Iranian will have on the region, no doubt about it, will have an impact on the economy of the world. The next challenge is the Arab Spring. Let's not forget that the Arab society is still a tribal society. And in most of the countries, there are unsatisfied groups who are not identifying themselves with the regime. And the impact of the international crisis, the economic crisis, created a very serious economical situation in those countries. The social mobility in there is almost not existing. And let's not forget that Islam is not only a religion, it's a culture that is crossing every aspect of life. This conflict is not about democracy and freedom. This conflict is about domination. What kind of ideology is going to control and lead in those countries? And unfortunately, today, the most organized opposition that are existing in those countries are coming from the house and the schools of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis. And by definition, if they're going to gain in the long run, they might create a very serious challenge to Israel. We have to pay to one fact a very cautious understanding. One, we see that the problem is passing on almost with no problem solved in kingdoms, in countries where you have kings, because there is no real debate about the legitimacy of the regime. From the other hand, in all the countries where you have that the regime was taken by force by military rulers, the question of the legitimacy of the regime is still existing, and as such, the process of what we are calling so-called the Arab Spring is passing with a very serious amount of violence. It's happening in Syria, it's happening in Egypt, it's happening in Libya, in Yemen, in Somalia, and other countries. The next challenge is the terror challenge. We today are facing most of the terror attacks that we are suffering are coming from two schools. One of the Shia school, the other one from the Sunni schools. The Shia schools are supported, sponsored, and armed by the Iranian, the Hezbollah. They are located in our northern border, especially in the area of Lebanon. But let's not forget that we have Shia communities not only there, but in other countries. In the long term, they are creating a very serious problem, not only to us, but also to the current regime in those countries. The Sunni organization, like the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, are creating a very serious challenge for us because unfortunately, they're increasing their influence inside the Palestinian community, and not only inside the Palestinian community, but even though they suffer a very serious blow by killing Osama bin Laden, I think that the ideas that the Salafis and the Wahhabis are leading are still existing and rooted very deeply in almost every Islamic country. The Global Jihad is an organization that, gladly for us, we are not the only one who is facing this organization. I believe the West, as a state, as an entity, is facing the challenge of those organizations, and I think it's a cooperation between all the different countries on this issue could play a very vital role how to overcome this challenge. The last challenge that I will want to discuss is the new form of anti-Semitism that is existing today in the world. We started to see an unholy alliance between impossible groups. From one side, radical Islamic groups, from the other side, left-wing radicals and right-wing radicals. And in some countries, even academic groups are supporting, and especially when some of them are challenging the legitimacy of the state of Israel to exist, is creating in the long term a very serious challenge to our country. Nevertheless, some of those groups are involved in terror activities against Jewish targets around the world, and unfortunately, In the last few months, we saw such attacks in India, in France, in Ukraine, and other countries. What are the lessons that we have to draw from those challenges? The first one is time is in essence. We need to find a very quick solution to the Palestinian problem. I believe it's had a very devastating impact on our relationship with the Western countries and creating some even debates with our biggest friend, the United States. I think that as a result of the Arab Spring, I think that we are not going to see any immediate conventional threat in the next 2 to 3 years, because most of those countries, especially those countries who were in the past involved in wars against Israel, are so occupied with their internal problems that I don't see an immediate military threat directed against Israel. The Arab League is a less confronting Arab League that we ever knew. All those radical elements like Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, are not among us anymore. And even Bashar Assad, who used to play a pivot role in approaching with a radical approach against Israel, is now involved very much internally in a very serious problem in his own country. We can identify a large amount of common interest between us and many of the Arabic pragmatic states. And in some aspect, we are sitting in the same camp together with those countries, especially on the issue, on the Iranian issue, and on the issue of radical Islamic organizations are threatening those countries as they're threatening Israel. I believe that the best way how to tackle the Shia terrorist problems is to find a way that Bashar Assad will leave his power, and by leading and allowing Syria to become dominated by the Sunnis, probably we're going to see a greater influence of the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia, and I believe it will have a moderated impact on Syria. It will eliminate a great deal of support to the Hezbollah in Lebanon. It will stop the channel of smuggling into the hands of the Hezbollah, and will create a serious declining of influence by the Hezbollah in Lebanon itself. The last issue, I believe that we'll have to deal with the Iranian issue in one way or another. I agree with the Prime Minister, Olmert, who said that we don't have differences about the level of the threat. We have a difference, what is the best way how to deal with it. And I agree totally that the Iranian threat is not only an Israeli problem. It's first of all an international problem, and it should be solved by the international community. It's presenting a serious threat to the countries in the Gulf, to Saudi Arabia, even to Iraq. And unfortunately, this regime is acting very cleverly, and they are smart. They are masters in diplomacy, and I believe they will do everything in their power, even though I don't think that they are running into the project, but they are going very cautiously to achieving and to acquire such a threat. I believe that this problem should be dealt internationally, and I believe one of the biggest mistakes is to translate the conflict between Israel and Iran as an issue for the world between those two countries. It's a serious threat to the region, it's a serious threat to the world economy, it's a serious threat to the stability of the region, and I believe it's creating, if it will not be dealt in the right way, it will lead to an arms race, a nuclear arms race, not only in the Middle East, but in the world. Thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to JEM. To JEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.